It is a message in plain English that gets printed. Now let's try how we can improve this method by doing two things. First, let's try to introduce some meaningful names. Then let's have a look at how we could break this method into more manageable functions. I have listed down the variables and the functions that we saw in the length book function, their purpose, and I have suggested some better names. So let's look at the first two, MID and BID. Obviously, these represent the member ID and book ID. And if we name them as such, as member ID and book ID, they don't need any explanation at all. It is quite clear to the reader what they represent. Let's look at the method name, checkDBMember, which validates whether the user is already a member, can be easily named as isLibraryMember, which is self-descriptive on the functionality that it performs. The same goes for the rest of those variables and methods or the functions. Out of all these, I need to highlight row number 7. Now, this is a variable where its name is a single letter. These kind of variable names are not descriptive at all, and you have to put a lot of effort in trying to understand what these variables mean. Therefore, this is something that you have to avoid in all cases. Perhaps one exception for such variables is when they are being used as loop counters. For example, in a while loop. Apart from that, make sure that you don't name variables with a single letter at any cost. This is the same lengthbook function with the improved names replaced with the previous names. Starting with the arguments, member ID and book ID, which are self-descriptive, and moving on to the functions. As you can see, isLibraryMember and getBookLengthToDate. They actually represent by the names what those functions actually do. And it's almost like asking a question. The if condition asking a question is isLibraryMember and pass the corresponding member ID. And this condition or the validation here, it does not represent the number 2. Instead, the numbers have been assigned to a variable, which is again carrying a meaningful name. The max books to length explains what number 2 is, and same goes for length time period, which represents what number 14 is. And that is being used in the return date calculation. As you can see, simply by improving what variables and functions are named, we have significantly improved the readability of the code. Even though we have not changed the number of lines in the method, when you read along, it is quite easier to understand what each and every line represents. The second factor which impacts the readability of the function is that this function does too many things. For example, this checks whether the user is eligible for a book to be lent. It checks whether the user is a member and whether the member has lent more than 2 books. Then it checks the book's availability, calculates the return date, checks out the book, and in cases where the validations fail, it prints messages so that the user understands what went along. So let's try to break this function into more manageable pieces. And I would like to take this piece of logic where it checks the user whether the user is eligible for a book lending. And secondly, the piece of logic which does the return date calculation, which could be reusable within the system as well. What you see on the screen is a new function that we have created by extracting the piece of code which did the member validation or checking the member eligibility. As you can see, since this is a function, this returns something out. So it is as if the function is member eligible for lending. It's like asking a question from the function, is this member ID eligible for lending? And the function says true or false. The is eligible variable is set to false, and only if the two conditions or the two validations are successful, it is assigned to true. The second function that we have extracted out is the calculation of the return date. Again, the function name is self-descriptive, get book return date, and we have moved this particular variable inside this function as well. And the rest is the code which is responsible for calculating the return date. This is what you get after applying better names, and instead of the elaborative code that we had in the function, we extract out the logic into other smaller manageable functions. The number of lines of code has been reduced, and the code is much more readable compared to what it was. So if you read along, it's like we are reading a particular description written in English. It's first of all, it's asking if is member eligible for lending, and passes a member ID, and the function says true or false. And depending on that, if the member is eligible, then it again asks the question, is book available? Passing the book ID. And if it's again true, if the function says true, then the logic knows it can move into calculating the return date and checking out the book. And that's exactly what it does. The return date is being calculated from the get book return date function. And then you have a method for checkout book. So compared to where we started, isn't this much more readable? This actually reads the code as if you're reading a story or a description about the flow diagram that we had a look at. Before we move on, I would like to emphasize what these two new functions do. The is member eligible for lending function, it only validates whether the member is eligible for lending. It does one thing, and hence this is a function with a single responsibility. The same goes with get book return date and is book available. There are also functions with a single responsibility where one checks whether the book is available and the other calculates the return date of the book. This brings to the end of our session today. Let's summarize what we have learned. Out of the 4 qualities of clean code, we did a deep dive on readability. We've identified 5 critical techniques of writing readable code, and we deep dive on using meaningful names and writing functions with a single responsibility. And through an example, a flow diagram, as well as a function which was badly written, we applied these 2 techniques and looked at how the readability of the function improves. In the next part of this lesson, we are going to deep dive on the rest of the 3 techniques that we did not discuss during this session. Before that, make sure that you again go through this lesson, understand the flow diagram better, understand the code example better, and look at how these techniques help improve the badly written method to a much more readable method. And also, if time permits, get your hands dirty by applying these techniques into the code that you write. Until I speak to you on our next session, have a good one.